Trump to hold talks with Xi Jinping as the U.S. pushes China to cut Russian oil imports. We'll talk about this with David Tafuri, international lawyer and former U.S. State Department official. David, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Great to see you again. Thanks for having me.
David, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov stated that Moscow has declared that it expects clear guarantees from the West that the upcoming meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin will yield a concrete result. Lavrov claimed that during the previous meeting between Trump and Putin in Anchorage, the Russian side allegedly agreed to a number of initiatives presented by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff during his visit to Moscow. How should Lavrov's statements be interpreted? What specific guarantees is Moscow seeking from the West regarding the outcome of the upcoming Trump-Putin meeting?
Well, it's not entirely clear, but I can only assume that Putin is like a broken record saying the same things he has been saying since February 2022, insisting that Ukraine cannot be part of NATO, that it cannot be part of the EU, that it can't build up its military, that has to give up all of the territory that Russia has taken, and even more than that, including some of the territory that Ukraine still occupies. And so I don't understand why there would be a meeting until Putin and Russia have compromised and made concessions that bring it closer to what Ukrainians need to believe that a ceasefire would be effective and would meet their aspirations for future security and to avoid another conflict with Russia.
David, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has said Kremlin dictator Vladimir Putin is unlikely to accept a peace proposal currently being developed by the coalition of the willing. It is evident. What are the main elements of the peace proposal currently being developed by the coalition of the willing? Your thoughts?
Well, look, there should be a ceasefire, and it could be contoured along the concept of Europe and especially France and UK providing some security guarantees, even providing troops that could monitor the ceasefire and make sure that Russia does not violate the ceasefire. It would be a cessation of hostilities along the lines of the current front line, but without an agreement right now that Ukraine is giving up that territory that Russia illegally took. That's the contours, basically, of a ceasefire with Russia, but Russia hasn't agreed to any of those things.
David, yes, President Donald Trump plans to hold a conversation with China on October 30th. This could become an important step if, following the sanctions, Beijing reduces its imports of energy resources from Russia, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Zelenskyy commented on the latest U.S. sanctions measures against Russia and explained their political significance. According to him, the sanctions imposed by President Trump demonstrate the United States' capabilities and send a signal to Congress. How significant could the October 30th conversation between President Trump and Chinese leader be in reshaping global energy flows, particularly regarding Russia's exports?
Well, first of all, President Zelenskyy is right to commend the U.S. and President Trump for issuing these new sanctions on Russian oil companies. Frankly, those sanctions should have been done a long time ago. They should have been done under the Biden administration. And President Trump was promising new sanctions for a while. He went back and forth. It looked like he might not do them, but now he has done them. And hopefully that's a message to Russia that if Russia does not start to make concessions, does not start to be more reasonable, does not back off on its attacks on Ukraine that are killing civilians, that there will be more sanctions. My personal view is that more sanctions are going to be necessary, that there will have to be also pressure on India and China and Turkey and the other countries that are buying Russian oil. And that can start perhaps in the meeting that President Trump and President Xi are having about U.S.-China trade. Notably, also part of that meeting between Trump and Xi will be about the fact that she has stopped buying as much U.S. gas and oil as it was. And if it were to buy more from the U.S., it could buy less from Russia. And along with the sanctions on Russia, that's the kind of thing that's necessary to really hurt the Russian economy in a way that Putin feels forced to make a fair deal.
David, we will discuss sanctions with you in more detail a little later. About China, more analysts note that Chinese officials may use the meeting to force Trump to clarify the yes position on Taiwan. She is expected to try to get the yes to publicly declare that it does not recognize the island's independence, which would be in line with the position of previous administration and would be welcomed by Beijing. Your opinion, and could China's attempts to secure a public U.S. statement rejecting Taiwan's independence overshadow discussions on Russia and energy sanctions?
I certainly agree with the premise of the question that President Xi would like to get the U.S. President Trump to say something about Taiwan that suggests that the U.S. is changing its policy and less inclined to defend Taiwan if attacked by China. So for that reason, I think President Trump has to be very careful about the words he uses when he talks with President Xi about Taiwan if the issue comes up, and I do expect it will come up. And he should stick to the policy that the U.S. has had of strategic ambiguity for many years across Democratic and Republican presidents, which suggests to China that the U.S. might, in fact, defend Taiwan, and that is a deterrence. And notably, President Biden went even further than that, actually admitting, perhaps by mistake, that the U.S. plan, at least under the Biden administration, was to defend Taiwan if attacked. We at least want President Trump to convey that it is possible the U.S. will come to Taiwan's defense, because that makes it less likely that China will engage in that provocation.
The audience, feel free to write your comments. Also, more about sanctions. Orban says, yes, sanctions targeting Russian oil companies are a mistake. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban wants to meet with US President Donald Trump to discuss the necessity to Russian oil supplies to Hungary, according to Bloomberg. And the media outlet writes that Hungary's reliance on Russian oil could threaten its energy security, as the US has imposed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. Meanwhile, the EU has decided to completely ban financial transactions with Rosneft and Gazprom Neft, as well as to phase out imports of Russian LNG by 2027. How does Budapest justify continued reliance on Russian oil within the framework of EU solidarity and the bloc's collective sanctions policy? What message does Orban intend to convey to President Trump regarding Hungary's necessity to maintain access to Russian energy supplies?
Well, there's no good justification for what Orban is saying, and he is the outlier here. His viewpoint is different from almost all of the other EU countries, except perhaps for Slovakia. And Orban has an affinity for Putin. Orban has moved Hungary more towards nationalist policies, towards an autocracy. He's taken away the rights of many people in Hungary. He's degraded the rule of law in Hungary. And so it's not surprising that he has, this friendship for Putin, and he's defending Putin. But ultimately, Hungary is part of the EU. It depends for its economy on trade with other European countries. And I think if Europe put more pressure on Hungary, especially, as you mentioned, to follow the new sanctions on Russian oil companies, I think Hungary would ultimately have to capitulate. It cannot possibly rely on trade with Russia versus trade with all of the other European countries.
Hungary aims to join forces with Czechia and Slovakia to create an alliance within the European Union that takes a skeptical stance toward Ukraine. Prime Minister Viktor Orban's chief political advisor said in an interview with Politico. According to Orban's advisor, the Prime Minister wants to strengthen cooperation with Andrej Babiš, whose right-wing populist party recently won elections in Czechia, as well as with Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, in order to coordinate positions ahead of EU leaders' meetings and hold joint consultations before summits. How might such coordination among Orban, Babiš and Fico influence EU decision-making on aid, sanctions and enlargement related to Ukraine?
Well, again, this is a minority of countries, a very small minority within the EU. These countries rely upon good relations with the other EU countries. And so it's up to the other EU countries to put more pressure on them. They're really going down the wrong path here. Democracies need to work with each other, and these three countries are all democracies. And it's unfortunate that they've taken this position vis-a-vis Russia. I also think Ukraine and President Zelenskyy has some work to do here. He needs to find common ground with Orban, with the leaders of the other two countries, and try to explain and convince them that it is in Hungary's interest to ally itself with Ukraine, that Hungary too is threatened by a Russia that is seeking territorial expansion. And Hungarians know that. They experience that. So did people in the former Czechoslovakia, which was invaded by the Soviet Union. And so both the EU and Ukraine and perhaps the US need to put more pressure on these countries to amend their view and to fall in line with the majority of democracies around the world, which are supporting Ukraine, and understand it's essential to put economic sanctions on Russia to hurt Russia's economy, make it harder for Russia to buy the weapons it is using to kill innocent civilians in Ukraine against the law.
David, we talked about China and now about India, because Indian oil refineries have not placed new orders for Russian oil purchases since the imposition of US sanctions. They are waiting for clarifications from the government and suppliers. And according to the Reuters, some refineries are using spot markets to meet their crude oil needs. How are Indian refineries adjusting their procurement strategies in response to US sanctions on Russian oil?
Well, this is a really good thing, and it shows that the secondary tariffs that Trump put on India might be working. But the U.S. has to be vigilant about keeping the pressure on India. There should both be the U.S. standing behind those tariffs and also the U.S. in productive dialogue with the government of India to try to convince India to reduce its purchases of Russian oil. And NOTE recently estimated that these collective measures against Russia's economy will likely cause Russia to lose 20 to 30% of its revenues. That's the type of significant change and damage to the Russian economy that's essential to get Russia to make concessions.
David, Baltic companies secretly refueling Russia's shadow fleet, reported by LRT. A network of fast bunkering companies operating in Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, specializing in vessel refueling, is helping Russia's shadow fleet evade sanctions, according to an investigation by the Lithuanian public broadcaster. Simple question, why?
I guess for money. That's the only reason why. If you're from a Baltic country, most of the population in the Baltic states is supporting Ukraine, is very concerned and worried about Russia. Russia has engaged in provocations against the Baltic states and has talked about wanting to take territory from the Baltic states. So it's a huge mistake for these companies to be aiding and assisting Russia. And I hope the countries that they're from will prosecute them for violating the law.
Also, David, about Russian assets, very important topic. Leaders of Northern European countries and the European Commission support a plan to use frozen Russian assets to finance Ukraine. The Guardian reports the proposal is to take these cash balances to give a loan to Ukraine that Ukraine has to pay back if Russia pays reparations. And therefore, it's legally a sound proposal, not trivial, but a sound proposal, says European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. What legal frameworks allowed the use of frozen Russian assets to provide financial support to Ukraine? And how would the proposed loan mechanism operate? And what conditions would govern repayment if Russia pays reparations?
Well, this has been an evolving policy. Remember, the US and EU countries froze Russian central bank assets that were within its jurisdiction and within its control right after the invasion in February 2022. And since then, there's been this discussion about whether or not to utilize those frozen assets. Normally, assets, when they belong to a government and they're frozen pursuant to sanctions, they aren't actually then taken. But there is some precedent for taking them, and the law was changed here in the US, and I believe also changed in the EU to make it easier to take them in this specific instance because of the violations of international law by Russia. Already, the US and EU have been using the interest on the frozen funds as collateral to make loans to Ukraine. And so this is a logical next step to make those assets even more available to support Ukraine. It's also really important, in my view, because as we switch from the Biden to Trump administration, the US stopped providing significant funding to Ukraine. And so these Russian central bank assets, which are estimated to be around $300 billion, most of them in Europe, in banks in Europe, including particularly in Belgium, could make up the deficit from the US not providing funding.
David, I see new information also about China. Chinese company is increasing imports of Russian oil to compensate for cancelled supplies after the UK imposed sanctions on the refinery, Reuters reports. The refinery, the newest in China, with a daily processing capacity of 400,000 barrels per day, is operating at over 90% capacity. What do you think about this?
I think that in the talk between Trump and President Xi, there needs to be a very fulsome conversation about China's support for Russia. And President Trump needs to find ways as part of these negotiations between the U.S. and China over a number of different trade issues to provide incentives to China to not support Russia, to not have its companies buy as much Russian oil and gas as they are buying. And this is essential for harming Russia's economy.
David, and about Trump's visit, let's talk about this. During President Donald Trump's official visit to Tokyo, the Japanese government made an unusual diplomatic gesture to show respect and goodwill toward the American leader, according to the Associated Press. As part of the visit, 3 American-made vehicles were displayed outside the Akasaka Palace to impress Trump and emphasize support for U.S. manufacturing. What can you say about this visit, the results?
Well, this is kind of interesting. I mean, normally when a U.S. president visits a foreign country, there is some pomp and circumstance. And what I think countries have realized is that Trump really enjoys and is moved by these demonstrations of pomp and circumstance and, a little bit of exposure to the culture. We saw when he landed in Malaysia, there were dancers dancing and singing traditional Malaysian songs. And so this is, part of the recognition by foreign countries that to have a good meeting with President Trump, there are a lot of optics that help support him being in, feeling comfortable and feeling some affinity for the countries that he's visiting.
Mr. Tafuri, thank you for this interesting conversation. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. David Tafuri, international lawyer and former U.S. State Department official, was with us today. Thank you for watching. Please share this interview and continue supporting Ukraine. See you.
Дякую. Слава Україні.
Героям слава.